has now been 20 years since Putin took power in Russia. Back then, Russia was still recovering from the collapse of the Soviet Union and the chaotic nature of the 90s.
In the time of plague, the words of Alexander Pushkin, Russia's greatest poet. In this new time of troubles, on the square that bears his name and statue, Pushkin now contemplates McDonald.
Now, in 2020, events happening both within and outside of Russia did not become any less destabilizing. With chaos spreading in Ukraine as a result of the Maidan coup, the Russian Federation annexed the peninsula of Crimea, only contributing to the downward spiral of instability in the neighboring country. By now, Putin and his government had grandiose plans for Ukraine.
Counterpart this morning and said his country would not accept any Western ultimatum. Russian troops in Belarus, Ukraine's northern neighbor, started large-scale military drills this morning. The United States called it an escalatory action.
The political situation within Russia itself was not to his liking either, as sporadic pro-democracy protests kept happening in major urban centers all over the country, compelling the government to move against this fifth column. The beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic was not helping either. Despite all the military planning aimed at Ukraine, one of the biggest factors in the global oil trade, Saudi Arabia, collapsed into a civil war after the king died of COVID. In order to preserve global stability and a major partner in oil production, Putin ordered an intervention on the side of the official government in Riyadh, even permitting the deployment of a certain PMC. To the surprise of all international observers, the official government was aided not just by Russia, but also South Korean, British and French troops, in opposition to the Germans who intervened on the side of the self-proclaimed Republic, and to the Chinese who intervened on the side of the Royal Coalition in the south of the country. In July of 2021, the United States also collapsed into civil war. This caused a major financial crisis across the countries of the West. But for Russia, this was like blood in the water. The West was now considerably weaker. However, in November, Putin himself fell ill with COVID-19. Surprisingly though, despite all expectations, he resigned as president in light of his failing health, leaving Sergei Naryshkin as acting president, who promptly announced a snap election. 2 months later, chaos erupted in Kazakhstan, causing a Russian intervention, resulting in the overthrown President Tokayev being reinstalled to power. Around the same time, Putin had passed away, being unable to win his battle against COVID. Meanwhile, at the home front, the government of United Russia was using the entirety of the might of the administrative resource easily available to them. Predictably, Medvedev won the election.
Я могу вам сказать только одно. Никто никогда не вернется в 2007 год.
He began implementing his promised reforms of more democracy, unlike his strongman predecessor. However, not all members of United Russia were happy with this drive towards liberal reforms. One of such was the fervent nationalist Anton Alikhanov.
Депутаты Государственной Думы, стоять сейчас на этой трибуне для меня очень значимо. Предложение председателя правительства Михаила Владимировича Мишустина возглавить Министерство промышленности и торговли – это одновременно и доверие, и большая ответственность, особенно учитывая периметр и роль тех отраслей, которые курирует ведомство. Опыт работы в Минпромторге.
His loud opposition had him removed as governor of Kaliningrad. However, this did not discourage Medvedev's efforts in destroying the two mainstream alternatives, the CPRF and LDPR, in order to eventually establish a Russian two-party system. In November of 2022, the People's Republic of China began its invasion of Taiwan, even succeeding in this endeavor despite the efforts of the Japanese and Australians. Medvedev took this as a sign that countries like Russia now could act more freely without an America to keep them in check. By 2025, Medvedev felt confident in internal security to begin implementing his and formerly Putin's vision on the geopolitical stage. It began with threatening the states of Central Asia, bringing them under the Russian eagle's wing. With some minor resistance, the same was done in the Caucasus region. These engagements in the mountains proved that the army reforms that were implemented back in 2008 by Serdikov were obsolete. This convinced the military leadership to give a chance to Gerasimov's more Western-style doctrine, which focuses more on firepower and hybrid warfare using all modern means of engaging the enemy and their infrastructure. Rumors started circulating online of a coming Ukrainian offensive in the Donbass region, which would cause a renewal of decade-old hostilities. Medvedev knew he had to strike first to catch the AFU with their pants down, so to say. With a growing and reformed army, with new tanks beginning mass production, it will be a crime against the people of the Donbass not to use these new weapons to intervene in Ukraine. However, there were still serious concerns regarding a possible intervention by the European remnants of NATO in the case of war with Ukraine. To slow down any hypothetical European response, Medvedev's government began weaponizing gas, threatening Europe with restrictions on it. The Russia-friendly AfD government in Germany gave into all demands, as was expected. However, the more distant and independent Macron government in France resisted. Despite this minor hiccup, Germany being under Russia's thumb was adequate enough to hold back the Europeans until the Russian army could fight its way to more advantageous positions. The reformed Russian army now stood on guard along Ukrainian and NATO borders. Allied CSTO troops stood shoulder to shoulder with their Russian comrades. Kaliningrad was fully built up for a protracted defense under siege. However, the Stavka had to hurry up. The Washington government emerged victorious out of the American Civil War, and very well could rejoin NATO at any moment.
These same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
In January, the Russian Federation recognized the Donbas republics, reorganizing them into a new formation. The Russian army felt especially emboldened knowing that the southern flank is secured, as Turkey left NATO not too long ago. And thus, on February 2nd of 2027, the Russian army began executing a special military operation to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine, crossing the international border. However, after less than 2 weeks of combat, Poland accused the Russian army of attacking Polish border patrols, seeing it as an act of war. Following this, the Polish government invoked Article 5, dragging in other member states one by one. Now Europe was engulfed in a new Great European War.
По полюшку едет ВСУ, а за этим полюшком русский офицер четко корректирует смерч Искандер. 333 с ночи до зари, от рассвета до заката 333. 333 с ночи до зари, от рассвета до заката 333.
But this did not help save the Ukrainian state, which stood no chance. Now the Russian army was regrouping until military leaders considered their next actions. In March, the Russian army began a large-scale offensive into the Baltics, with the aim of capturing Tallinn and Riga.
Ночи до зари, от рассвета до заката 333. 333 с ночи до зари, от рассвета до заката 333. 333 с ночи до зари, за Россию матушку 333. 333 с ночи до зари, от рассвета до заката 333. 333 с ночи до зари, от рассвета до заката 333. За Россию матушку 333.
Цветет герань.
By May, goals of Riga and Tallinn, and even Vilnius, were captured, with puppet administrations established to govern the land. However, the rapid progress of the Russian and Allied armies was not enough to prevent the fall of Kaliningrad.
Цветет герань, этот запах разбудит самую рань. Герань, цветет герань, улетают лепесточки вдаль на твой Майдан. По Днепру цветет герань, только нету копирань.
Despite the stubborn defense of the entrenched NATO contingent, Kaliningrad was taken back in July of 2027. The new offensive began into Romania and Moldova on August 2nd of the same year. After the capitulation of Bulgaria, Greece too left NATO. This freed up the entirety of Gerasimov's army group to storm Central Europe. On October 2nd, the Russian army stormed across the Carpathian Mountains into the Pannonian Basin. With the fall of Hungary and the ongoing collapse of Slovakia, the army group on the Polish frontiers also began a front-wide offensive. On November 24th of 2027, the Russian army was halted in central Poland. But de facto and de jure, the war was over, with Russia emerging victorious. NATO was defeated. The old order was no more. The war was over. The dead have been counted. The damage was assessed. Novorossiya was annexed into Russia proper. But it too, just like the new territories and new European allies, had to be rebuilt. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, both government officials and people were shaken to the very core by the fact they lost the war in less than a full year of fighting, taking over 1 million casualties combined. Now, Germany was in the process of finalizing the federalization of the European Union. Meanwhile in Asia, tensions between ED and PDTO grew into a Great Asian War. When the process of rebuilding began to end, it was now time for Medvedev to implement the crescendo of his liberal reforms, establishing a two-party system, starting the first post-war election. The election season was tense, with many twists and intensified campaigning by United Russia and People's Russia. But despite their efforts, it turned out that the Russian people were not exactly enthusiastic about this two-party system, which they were told for decades is not a good thing, especially seeing how it turned out for America, plunging it into a civil war. Amidst this dissatisfaction, Anton Alikhanov and Vasily Vlasov have formed a radical nationalist party as an alternative, National Russia, promising to protect Russia, Russians, and Russian culture and way of life, promising that Russia will not have to experience what Alikhanov saw during NATO's brief occupation of the Kaliningrad Oblast. Despite the establishment's efforts, the people have chosen the alternative, Alikhanov. He was now the president. A true storm in the system. Immediately after his inauguration, Alikhanov began changing the inner workings of National Russia, renaming it to the Union of Defense of the People and the Nation. He also began implementing changes, making the state far more authoritarian than it ever was under Putin. Leaders of opposing parties were being found murdered and horribly disfigured beyond recognition. Members of the now underground, democratic and left-wing opposition united to oppose the rising tide of fascism in Russia. But despite all their effort, the state apparatus was too overwhelming for the underground resistance. Alikhanov entrenched his regime. The SZND focused on revivalism, reviving Russia's national culture with great focus on its Orthodox Christian roots, even nominally restoring the monarchical style of governance, even though Alikhanov never adopted a title akin to a prime minister, remaining the supreme head of state. Territorial changes also took effect, with Moldova and the Baltics becoming part of the new Tsarless Empire. As for national minorities, Alikhanov's nationalism emphasized spiritual unity in Christ, rather than ethnic nationalism. This was understandable considering Alikhanov himself is of mixed Georgian-Russian descent. Some called him the Beast of Kaliningrad. Some dissenters called him the Animal of Kaliningrad. But enemies called him a monster. Meanwhile in the EU, troubling news were coming. The president of the Federalized Union was now Klaus Schwab. The growing number of military vehicles and personnel could not be hidden anymore. It was obvious. The globalist cabal which now enslaves the peoples of Europe was preparing to strike at Russia for a second time. The Russian army was lining up its forces all along the EU CSTO border. The EU mirrored Russia's actions, doing the same. The army was ready. Now was the time to strike. The EU had already absorbed Central and Western Europe, Iberia, Ireland, Scandinavia, and the Balkans. It was now only a matter of time before these demons would move their battle banners eastwards, towards Russia. Russia had to strike first. It is a strong country. Only weak countries allow others to declare war on them. But great powers do not let that happen. Instead, it is they who declare war on others.
Нарушение работы несущих.
European forces were able to stabilize the frontline in the Balkans with American support. This showed that unlike the First War, this one will be far more serious, with many more losses yet to come for both sides. Seeing how almost suicidally the Europeans are charging at Russian defenses, the Stavka decided to nuke 3 major urban centers of the EU: Milan, Berlin, and Paris. These strikes seemingly forced EU command to calm down their onslaught. In June of 2032, Günther Fellinger and his Balkan Commission were beaten out of the region. A general offensive could now begin into Germany. The fall of Berlin had alarmed the European command, as EU resistance became noticeably stiffer, with European soldiers and mobilized personnel beginning to once again throw themselves at the Russians in hopes of halting their advance. After the capitulation of the Scandinavian Commission, Alekhanov ordered an occupation of Finland, which was considerably easier than storming into Germany.
Unten bleiben! Sind in Reichweite ihres... Stehen bleiben, du Schwein! Hände hoch!
Nächstes Mal!
Почему? Возглавляю атаку!
Вы в самой... Очередью по цели! Огонь!
By February of 2036, the Russian army went around the European armies from behind, taking Paris without a fight. The Europeans were caught off guard, offering the Russians an opportunity for one big offensive, pinning down enemy forces to prevent them from reinforcing their French sectors. With the capitulation of the EU, the Iberian Commission was now completely defenseless. The war was over. Russia took well over 2 million casualties. The EU sacrificed over 6 million of its soldiers in attempts to stop the Green Wave. But it was futile. The spirit of the Holy Faith allowed Russian soldiers to emerge victorious over the globalist Antichrist. The Russian population was devastated by the economic damage and the great loss of life among the nation's young men. However, Europe was much worse off. It was bombed, it was droned, it was rolled over, and it was nuked. Towards the end of the war, the United Kingdom joined the CSTO, seeing how the war was going to end inevitably. The enemies of the sacred Russian Empire were utterly crushed in Europe. However, there were still enemies around the world. While a radical nationalist Russia established itself in Europe and the Middle East, a communist China secured its positions in Asia, while the United States were now controlled by a secretive cabal who were willing to say that 2 + 2 = 5 in order to hold total control over the thoughts of their citizens. Despite killing thousands in zeal, even millions, the ideology of Dejavism proved to be a project made to last 1,000 years, inspiring millions not just in Russia, but the world over. Russia achieved its geopolitical goals, permanent security in Europe, and a multipolar world order, all under the guiding lights of its great and benevolent leader, Anton Alekhanov.